At 10, the full story on the Challenger tragedy with reports from the White House, the Cape, and New England. Plus the rest of the news. Ronald Mcnair steps aside, a Super Bowl drug scandal, the amazing sports, Lynn's weather, and Stu's review of Uptown It's Hot. We'll see you soon.
I read it every day for news around the USA.
I read it every day.
A Challenger mission, but then a devastating explosion killed the 5 men and 2 women on board, including Krista McCullough, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. NASA officials say they do not know what went wrong. I'll be back in just a moment.
Good evening, I'm John Rowland. This is the 10 o'clock news. The incredible risk and danger that goes with every manned flight to space exploded before our eyes today and temporarily blinded us to the years of successes. In fact, these days, there are so many successes that a blastoff seems pretty routine to the man on the street. A man like John Glenn, though, knew better. As the first American to ride one of those giant rockets filled with explosive fuel into orbit, he knew the danger. He and the 7 original Mercury astronauts often talked about the day the odds would run out. Well, they did today for the 7 members of the Challenger crew. The shuttle blew up just over a minute after taking off. One of the 7 killed was Krista McCullough. She was to be the first teacher in space. Her family and friends made a special trip to the Cape from New England. Reporter Shirley McNerney of our station WCVB went along, and she has the story of their happiest day that so quickly turned to their saddest.
What happened here today was truly horrifying for everyone who watched, but especially for the families. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger left their quarters before sunrise. They had been disappointed yesterday, but today they would lift off. In the White Room, outside the shuttle hatch, Concord, New Hampshire schoolteacher Krista McCullough was joking with the closeout crew. Then a quick handshake, and she was on board. The only concern today was with ice, which had formed on the shuttle support structure. For this was more New Hampshire than Florida weather, and the flight was delayed by an hour. In the VIP viewing area, meanwhile, the main concern was how to keep warm. 17 third graders from the Kimball School in Concord, New Hampshire, gathered on the top row of the bleachers. Krista's mother, father, sister, brother, and other relatives sat just below them. Her husband watched from the Launch Control Center.
90 seconds and counting.
The mood was upbeat. Children and adults were counting down with the clock. There was an air of excitement, for Krista's enthusiasm about the opportunity had spilled over to all members of her family.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
The first sign of trouble was when the separation occurred early. Then there were streamers and what appeared to be fireworks. But still, many people watching did not realize the danger, for they had never seen a launch before. It was only slowly that the realization hit. Then NASA confirmed their fears. This came from the PA system. Then, that there were abort procedures. Finally, that the vehicle had exploded. What had been silence was now tears. Everywhere, people could be heard crying. Initially, there was confusion. A NASA spokesman said the explosion occurred a minute 17 seconds into the flight at what is called max Q. This is maximum dynamic pressure. At this point, the orbiter bends. The engines are throttled back and then forward again. It was widely believed that a booster rocket exploded when the shuttle had expended only a third of its fuel, causing a massive explosion. At a 4:30 news conference, Jess Moore, the Associate Administrator of Space Flights, called the catastrophe a national tragedy.
I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
For the News Star Network, I'm Shirley McNerney.
This was to have been a triumphant day for high school social studies teacher Krista McCullough.
A day that she'd been waiting and working for ever since last summer when she was picked to be America's first educator to go into space. And it was almost as exciting for her friends and fellow teachers and her students who gathered this morning to watch the shuttle launch on TV. But the excitement and anticipation turned to shock and grief. We have two reports.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water. We are awaiting verification from as to the location of the recovery forces in the field to see what may be possible at this point.
I think she's brave for going up. I mean, I admire her. I probably wouldn't have the guts to do it.
I just didn't believe it at first when it blew up. Just, you know, I was pretty shocked, and then I found out why everybody was quiet. All the teachers were upset. And
I couldn't believe it. I still can't believe that something this terrible happened. I just can't believe it. And people just went total silence.
Krista was a risk taker, and she encouraged kids to try things and to go beyond anything they'd done before. And her mission didn't work, but I think it's important for people to know and for kids to know that even if something doesn't work, you should still try.
For a moment this morning, nearly all of Concord stood still. It took that long for the realization to sink in. In downtown Concord, shock and disbelief were the only reactions. Many who knew the McCullough family say the reality of death still has not sunk in.
I know Steve. It's a very sad day.
Were you watching it on television when it happened?
Someone just, one of my people down the hall just said that the shuttle blew up, and we turned on the radio and then came downstairs to see it on TV.
What can one say? It's a sad day. My heart goes out to Krista's husband and her children. An exciting day has turned into a very sad one.
In the McAuliffe's neighborhood, the family's brown wood frame house sits closed with only a police guard standing by.
A teacher in space. It was the president's idea. He was proud of it. He gathered the semifinalists around him in the White House. And later, he had the vice president announce the final choice.
I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
At the McAuliffe home in Concord on the day of Krista's selection, her son Scott watched with pride, and her young daughter Carolyn dreamed her mother's dream.
Actually, when I grow up, I'm going to be in space. That's why.
Overnight, Krista became the best and the most dedicated ambassador of goodwill the American space program ever could have hoped for. As a teacher, her vision was simple and universal.
I'm really looking at the Earth as a whole group of people without the political boundaries, and I do that a lot in my classroom. And just to see that, and to maybe just see that the frailty of the planet is going to be a real new perspective for me.
Okay, Krista McAuliffe was a natural for this space mission, just the right mix of intellect, determination, and an infectious, almost childlike love of adventure and discovery.
And we did all sorts of Superman and Superwoman flights through the fuselage of the plane, and just standing on your head and all sorts of things. It is a lot of fun to be up there.
I knew she was always outgoing and very gregarious, but I didn't think she could keep it up for 14 hours a day for 6 months, which she apparently can.
Okay, up on the stool there. Real
up here?
It's on the shirts and the jacket.
By virtue of her natural exuberance and enthusiasm, Krista never seemed to be resented by her fellow astronauts. All through their months of training, she was the focus of public attention, the teacher. In space, she would have kept a journal and taught 2 live lessons. Along with her, she was going to take 20 personal items, space mementos for other members of her family.
I'm still going to be taking one of Scott's frogs, and I'm taking a cross and chain for Caroline. My dad would like me to take his wedding band, but it doesn't come off his finger as yet, so I'll probably be flying something different for my family.
A little while ago, Krista watched her first launch from Cape Canaveral.
To be there and to feel that ground shake and to hear the sound just fill the air and that bright, bright white of the exhaust in the shuttle. Oh, it was just an amazing sight. I'm so excited about the people who are going to be coming down and watching my flight.
Her flight, so tragic and so brief. But these are not the images she would want us to think of when we remember her. Better to remember the smile.
If there was one moment and one place to mark America's anguish today, it was at Cape Canaveral in the stands. Krista's husband and parents had gathered along with the other proud relatives. They were united with that country in that moment of their grief.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are awaiting verification from as to the location of the recovery forces in the field to see what may be possible at this point.
Talk first of all with Congressman Nelson. It was just 2 weeks ago that you lifted off. Do you think that we have oversold this space program and the space shuttle program in terms of what it can do, because this was such a shock to so many people?
Of course it was a shock. It was a shock to all of us. No, we haven't oversold it. We've had some 24 exceptionally successful flights. And the system works well. Obviously, there was a major malfunction that is tragedy today. We'll find out what the problem is, and we'll fix it. And the space shuttle will continue to be America's way to go into space and return. It's important to the future of this country.
But when you went for that ride 2 weeks ago, were you forewarned by NASA that something like this could happen? You know that there's a risk involved. But this is a calamity of a magnitude that no one anticipated.
Every member of the crew understands there's a risk. You don't expect that this kind of tragedy is going to occur. We had a malfunction right after we cleared the tower. And immediately, our pilot, Charlie Bolden, jumped on it, corrected the malfunction, and you know the perfection of our mission. That was not to be today.
David Scott in New York, you're now president of our rocket company. Do you think that we've got too much invested in the manned space shuttle program? A lot of people are talking today about the use of unmanned vehicles just to launch satellites and other things. Is that a better way for us to go in the future?
Well, I think, Tom, there must be a balance between the manned and the unmanned programs. I think each has its role to play. But in general, I believe we can proceed further into the exploration and utilization of space with manned programs because of man's natural ability to judge things, evaluate things, and use his mind as a computer. But there are roles for both manned and unmanned vehicles.
And Wally Schirra in San Diego, as you watched all of this unfold today, as you've been there since day one, what was your reaction to what you saw?
Tom, when I first saw it, I was quite surprised. I hear you fine. Who's cutting in?
Why don't you just keep on talking to me, Wally, and ignore that other voice if you can.
Hello, Tom. I'm kind of warm out here in California.
Right.
The Ma Bell isn't working too well for us, but the shock I had this morning was seeing not instant replay, but almost instant, of debris coming down, and I began to think, my God, it finally happened. After 25 years, we lucked out that long. The statistics finally caught up to us. Of course, we felt that this could happen to us any time, but we decided it shouldn't happen, and we changed the name from rocket to booster, assuming that it would be safer that way. But I can recall going through Mercury and Gemini with what were rockets, and finally flying on that Apollo with a man-made rocket or a man-made booster, which is what we saw today. It just turns out that eventually we're going to find something going wrong.
All right, Mr. Scott, Mr. Schirra, you're both highly trained astronauts. What about the idea of putting a civilian in space? And then we'll get Bill Nelson's reaction to that as well. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think that naturally civilians have a role in space because the civilians have roles everywhere. And as we expand into space, explore the universe, and conduct our science, I think we can't limit that just to the military, although, as you well know, the military also has a role in space.
And what about you, Wally? Do you think that we should continue to put civilians in space?
Well, of course, Tom. It's like an airplane. We've had some horrible accidents in the calendar year '85 with aircraft, and anything you do is high risk. When we think of gasoline that we carry in an automobile, that could be a bomb, too, if it's hit the wrong way. So it's a case of just realizing that what we do when we move around is very high risk.
And Mr. Griffin, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston tonight, this is going to be a terrible setback for NASA, isn't it?
Well, obviously, Tom, it's a great personal loss for many of us, and it's also a situation that we've got to understand and correct. Anytime you have something like this, I'd have to call it a setback, but we've had them before, and we're at the point now where we've got to get on and understand this problem and correct it, and I think we can come back from it.
Do you think it's a good idea to continue the civilian in space program?
Well, yes, I think you've got to take a step back, and today we are worried about the events of today and mostly yesterday and tomorrow. But as you really think about what we're trying to do in space, it's not just to put people into orbit in the shuttle. We are literally trying to build a whole infrastructure, ultimately, that will allow us to completely expand and take full advantage of this rather new ocean that we have spent 25 years getting to the point where we are today. As part of that, obviously, civilians of all walks of life I think, will ultimately inhabit that infrastructure. And there's no time better than today to begin that.
Congressman Nelson, I know that the Space Shuttle program is important to you personally and to your district as well, but we do have an enormous investment in that single program. Wouldn't it be a better idea for the United States to spread it out a little bit, to have more unmanned rockets, for example, in addition to the shuttle program? We've got so much invested in the shuttle itself.
Well, we do have investments. The Air Force continues to have an expendable launch vehicle, and they're planning that through the next decade. But we developed the shuttle to be America's space transportation system, and there's no reason that it can't continue to be once we find out what was the cause of this tragedy. I think that we'll find the problem, we'll correct the problem, and we'll go on from there.
All right, Congressman Nelson, thank you very much. Mr. Griffin in Houston tonight. In New York, Mr. Scott. In San Diego, Wally Schirra. This has been, I know, a personal tragedy for all of you because you've all been involved in the program. Tonight, some of the shuttle's heat-resistant tiles are washing up, and they're being collected by people on the Florida coastline near Cape Canaveral. Those are the small tiles that we've made so much of over the years of the shuttle program. They protect it once it begins to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. The search for debris from the explosion is continuing tonight in other parts of the Atlantic in an area that is 60 miles wide and 120 miles long. And NBC's David Hazinski reports on that development.
Pieces of debris that have been recovered so far are being brought to the airbase at Cape Canaveral, where they'll be examined later. The explosion that blew apart Challenger spread debris over a wide area. 10 aircraft searched a 1,200-mile grid into the night and will go out again at first light tomorrow. At least 11 ships, including NASA, Coast Guard, and Navy vessels, are continuing the search for wreckage overnight. NASA has warned commercial fishing and private boaters to leave alone any wreckage they find and just report it to authorities. A NASA spokesman says it's critical that the wreckage not be disturbed and warned that some of it could be dangerous.
There were explosives aboard the shuttle, the solid rocket boosters. There was also toxic chemicals, hydrogen tetroxide, other acids, hydrazine, which are all very, very toxic.
Ocean depth at the crash point is only between 100 and 200 feet deep. NASA is expected to talk to the Navy tomorrow about bringing in divers or subs to recover any sunken wreckage that it finds. David Hazinski, NBC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
The official investigation into what went wrong today could take months. More about that now from NBC News science correspondent Robert Brazell, who has covered the space shuttle since it began. He's at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena tonight. Bob, we've already heard from Jess Moore that they're impounding even the notes of the people who were involved today, the technicians, and it looks like they're going to get the tapes and all the other telemetry as well, and it could be some time before we know anything. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, it's a very difficult task. It's what engineers call failure analysis. They have to, if they possibly can, to recreate the incident, either in a laboratory or some kind of model so that they understand exactly what went wrong. Because Until that happens, it's very clear that the shuttle can't fly again, and that's a necessary aspect to this investigation. Now, there are several lines of inquiry going on. They will study models of the rockets. They'll study every bit of data, every bit of voice communication, anything that could have gone on in the maintenance, anything that may have been seen by anybody during the entire process leading up to the launch and in that first minute and 15 seconds before the tragedy. It will take a long time. One of the crucial elements, as David Hazinski just pointed out, will be reassembling whatever debris is found in an Air Force Base locker down there in Florida. Anything could yield a clue. At this point, there are several hypotheses, and the one that we have heard mentioned the most often is that a piece of a fan in one of the main engines broke apart that flew through the edge of the main engine and then went into that external fuel tank, causing the external fuel tank to rupture and become a bomb. That's only a hypothesis. That's the one that we've heard the most often today, but it's going to take a lot of investigation until they find out exactly what went wrong.
Well, let's go over a couple of things that we do know, Bob. First of all, everything seemed very normal right up to the moment of explosion. In fact, it was so normal that as you heard the NASA commentator, he continued to talk about what he was seeing in his own telemetry. By then, the explosion had already occurred. The second point is, it appeared to me that the explosion was so thorough, so complete, that there's a good chance that that debris is so small and so shattered that they won't learn anything from it. Is that realistic?
Well, that certainly is. I mean, the NASA commentator, who is a public affairs officer, was looking at a different screen from his television screen, and it continued to tell him how far downrange it was. That was why he kept talking like that. It certainly is possible that it blew the whole thing apart in such a way that no clues will be found, but there is a lot of data that comes down besides the astronauts' voices, indicating the performance of each of the engines, the three main engines and the two solid rocket boosters that were going at that time, all the guidance systems and everything else on board. If there was any anomaly at all, anything at all went wrong, it should have shown up at that point. It wasn't hit by a foreign object. That was very clear. It was an explosion that occurred on board. Now, there are other areas to look at as well that might be considered, and this was something that we talked about before. There are explosive bolts all over, and other kinds of explosive devices all over the shuttle. Explosive bolts that are designed to send off the solid rocket boosters at 2 minutes into the flight. Explosive bolts to jettison the external fuel tank. If one of those had gone off prematurely, that certainly would have caused an explosion. But there's all kinds of redundancy and safety devices supposedly to prevent that from happening. But obviously something went wrong, and that's what they have to find out.
Robert Bazell of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena tonight, where he has been covering the flight of the Voyager spacecraft. That was a spacecraft flight of triumph, of course, sending back pictures from Uranus of those remarkable moons that we've all been seeing. Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher who was selected from more than 11,000 educators who wanted to fly in space, was easily the best known of the astronauts who died today. But the other 6 are not to be forgotten either. NBC's Tom Pettit tonight on this tragic loss of bright, dedicated people.
The crew of Challenger was distinguished, some more famous than others, but truly all-American.
I'm joined here at the Cape by astronaut Dick Scobie, who is to pilot the mission of STS-13, and our science correspondent Bob Bazell.
Dick Scobie, the pilot, had appeared on the Today Show during a launch in 1983. He was 46.
And I'm sure there'll be some problems to take care of along the way, which will be a challenge, and be able to come back and say I've done it, and hopefully go do it again quite a few times.
Smith was the co-pilot. He was 40. Judith Resnick, America's second woman in space and the first Jewish woman. And she was a TV expert on the Today Show.
And we get to do a little bit of everything and state of the art, and it's always a challenge.
She was 36. Krista McAuliffe was a high school teacher in Concord, New Hampshire. Her selection to be the first teacher in space had overshadowed the flight itself. She was 38.
I just took that chance, along with 11,000 other people, that it will give them maybe the inspiration to try something new and to take a chance.
11,000 other American teachers had lost out to her in the competition to be the first teacher in space. Ronald Mcnair, PhD in physics from MIT. McNair was the second black to have been in space, going for his second trip today.
You know, that wasn't the kind of thing a black kid thought about. You know, how do you get to do something like that? What do you do? And I pursued science with that in my mind, and it wasn't until recently that I saw a break to make a dream, you know, come true.
He was 35. Ellison Onizuka was 39. He was a Japanese-American from Hawaii. This would have been his second flight. He liked space work.
That's great. What a way to live.
Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force. The 7th crew member, Gregory Jarvis, engineer. Jarvis had been bumped from 2 previous flights to make room for politicians. Today was to have been his day.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
It was an all-American crew. Tom Pettit, NBC News, New York.
Today's shuttle mission had special meaning for teachers everywhere, of course, and the launch was watched in many classrooms across the country by students of all ages. One of those was the Canaveral, Ohio classroom of James Rowley, who was the runner-up in NASA's search for the teacher astronaut. Also in that classroom today was Mike Conway of NBC affiliate WKEF in Dayton, Ohio.
It's lunch hour for these Centerville High School students, but they wanted to be in class, to be with science teacher Jim Rowley. The students knew what the shuttle launch meant to him. Rowley was one of the semi-finalists for the Teacher in Space flight. And besides being on the flight, Rowley said the best place to be was with his students, helping them understand this historic flight of the Challenger.
Main engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1. It's all right.
The interest soon turned to bewilderment. For a few minutes, even Rowley didn't understand what was happening.
Go about 45 seconds after liftoff, a huge fireball. I don't understand.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Our director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Can we get the cameras?
The reaction of all of us across the country today when we realized that this was no longer science fiction, that we were dealing with reality. For President Reagan, this was to have been an upbeat evening. Mr. Reagan had planned to set out his agenda for the coming year in his State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress and the nation tonight. But that speech, understandably, was postponed. The president telling the nation instead that this was a day for mourning and for remembering. NBC's Chris Wallace followed today's events at the White House. Chris?
Tonight, the flag above the White House was lowered to half-staff, the president ordering a similar show of respect at all government installations. In a speech to the nation, Mr. Reagan called the accident a national loss and spoke directly to the school children who had watched it.
It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
The president had embraced the space program in part to blunt questions of his age, to show he was future-oriented. He proposed a teacher in space in his re-election campaign. And despite today's tragedy, he said the shuttle program will go on.
We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here.
Mr. Reagan was to make his State of the Union speech tonight and planned to go ahead even after the accident, saying you can't stop governing the nation. But the speech was postponed for a week after congressional leaders said there was no interest in politics tonight. And the fact is, the president was as powerless as everyone else today. A spokesman said Mr. Reagan was informed of the accident by the vice president and, like everyone else, rushed to a TV set.
Quite frankly, the president stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him.
Late today, the president still had no answers, but had found words to remember the shuttle crew.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Tomorrow, the president will perform one of the toughest parts of his job, calling the relatives of those who died on the shuttle. And later this week, he plans to attend a memorial service organized by NASA. Tom?
Is there any talk at the White House tonight of making extraordinary efforts on the part of this administration to reach out to teachers in the country and to school children as well? I was struck by the fact that the president made a special appeal to students tonight in his address, and also when Vice President George Bush arrived at the Kennedy Space Center today as the official representative of the president, he also spoke to the children of the country. Obviously, the White House is worried about the traumatic effect that this could have on kids across the country. Are they planning anything beyond what we heard today, Chris, that you know about?
Well, nothing specific that we've heard of, but I know that the president takes his role almost as national father very seriously, that he was shaken as he watched on TV, as all the rest of us did today, and he kept talking in a brief conversation with reporters about how terrible it must have been for the relatives, both children and adults, who had gone to the Cape to share in all the excitement and instead had been eyewitnesses to a terrible personal tragedy. I know that when those young servicemen died in the plane crash in Gander, he felt very strongly about going to Kentucky to a memorial service and meeting personally with all of the relatives there, and I'm sure he plans to do the same with certainly the relatives at a memorial service organized by NASA, and in any way he can to ease the pain and to gain some understanding in all this, not only for the school children, but for all of us.
And are any of the aides at the White House tonight talking about the wisdom of the civilian in space program? It was the president's idea to put a teacher in space after all. A lot of cynics at the time thought it was just a, if you will, an election year gimmick to pick a teacher who happened to be a woman, who happened to be from New Hampshire, to go into space. And now, of course, we've had this tragic loss. There's already a program in effect for journalists to go in space as well. Are they having second thoughts about all that at the White House, Chris?
They certainly are sad, and they certainly, you know, a lot of these people had personally met Krista McAuliffe in the Roosevelt Room right across from the Oval Office. Just last July, she had been selected as the teacher in space, and many of them had met her. But I don't think there are any second thoughts. One of the points that the president made over and over again today was that space is the safest form of travel ever known to man. There had been 56 manned space flights in the American program. This is the first time that during a flight anyone had been lost. He and his top aides are all determined that nothing in this one accident be allowed to kill the space program.
It's worth pointing out that Senator Jake Garn of Utah, who was a veteran of the Space Shuttle program as well as one of the politicians in space, pointed out today that very statistic that you just talked about and said each year 50,000 people are killed on the nation's highways, about half of them by drunk drivers, and we ought to be more exercised about that. Two NBC veterans of the exploration of space from its beginnings are NBC's Roy Neal and Jay Barbary. They have been covering this story now for more than a quarter of a century, but they've never seen a darker day than this one. Jay, as you can see, is at Cape Canaveral tonight, where he is always posted, and Roy Neal is at Pasadena at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory there. Roy, let's begin with you. 19 years ago yesterday at Cape Canaveral, the other deaths that were involved in this space program, on the launch pad, Apollo 1, in the capsule, astronauts Chaffee, Grissom, and White. What are your recollections about what happened that day and how they compare with today?
Well, the biggest recollection I have, Tom, is to relate that fire, which it was, in a pure oxygen environment, to what happened today, and to say there's no comparison, no basis for comparison. That particular tragedy called for a total realignment of the Apollo spacecraft, which was done, and about 2.5 years later, men were flying to the moon in the new changed spacecraft. Today, by comparison, this thing came on unexpectedly. The telemetry, I am told, coming back from the spacecraft was fine. Everything seemed to be working perfectly, and then suddenly, without warning, not even warning to the computers on board, which would have aborted the mission and perhaps even given the astronauts a fighting chance for their lives, no warning at all, suddenly there was an explosion. That's the big difference between that unexpected occurrence, which was, of course, a terrible tragedy in its time, but called for a recreation of the program, and the one today, which probably will call for a recreation of the program, but for different reasons.
And Jay Barbary in Cape Canaveral tonight, are you hearing anything at all from the NASA officials who are down there and the workers that you know so well, or are they absolutely mum on the situation?
Well, what we know tonight, Tom, is that already Jess Moore, who is the Associate Administrator of Manned Spaceflight for NASA, is heading an interim board. They're studying the data. What they have done, they have impounded everything, all the notes, anything that took place in the preparation of this mission. And they will appoint a board later after they have everything under control. And, of course, no shuttle will fly until the reason for this tragedy is known. And tomorrow we do expect that we will have another news conference in the afternoon and perhaps learn a little bit more about what is taking place and what is known at this early date.
Jay, were you in your customary post back there tucked alongside the NBC booth watching the space shuttle with your very good eyesight and describing it on radio at the time that it happened?
Yes, we weren't on live because, as people have pointed out, Tom, we've gotten a little blasé about this, but I was watching it. And there for a moment, as it climbed up into this dark blue sky, I had suddenly had the feeling that something was going to happen. And I was watching real close, and it did. And I knew when it happened what had happened. I saw the boosters, as everyone did, spiraling away, spinning madly. And I stood there watching for Challenger to reappear. I kept looking for Challenger and the crew, and Tom, it never came back. It was all in that fire.
This kind of moment has been at the back of the minds of all of us who have covered the space program since its inception. But we really never expected it to happen, did we, Jay?
No, we sure didn't. We expected it back in the days of Mercury and possibly Gemini. We expected it when John Glenn, they thought in Mercury Control that his heat shield had come off. We also had a near tragedy when Liberty Bell 7 was lost, and Gus Grissom had to swim for his life just 100 miles downrange from here. And then, of course, there was the Apollo 13, where the nation held its breath for 4 days. But we had gotten to the point with 24 successful shuttle missions that we thought the computers, I suppose, Tom, would take care of everything. Well, today they didn't.
And Roy Neal, the scientist and your contacts in NASA that you have talked to today, are they shocked? Are they being realistic about the possibility that this could have happened and it was going to happen sooner or later anyway? How are they feeling?
Well, first, Tom, they are shocked. They are mystified. And to them, this was something in many cases, particularly on the engineering rather than the science level, this was something that was indeed expected. They kept waiting for the axe to fall. And indeed, we at NBC, for example, in every case, at every liftoff and at every landing, have had the equipment standing by just in case. Always lurking in the back of our minds has been the thought that this is not the safe business. And, of course, we have the parallel of commercial aviation, or, if you will, the President of the United States. We even cover his aircraft when it takes off and when it lands.
Thank you very much, Roy Neal. In Pasadena tonight, Jay Barbary at Cape Canaveral. For almost 20 years now, the space program has moved along without a loss of life, although by no means without problems. Tonight, NBC's Robert Hager looks into NASA's troubles and its prospects now for the future.
The shuttle program had already been troubled by mechanical failures, cameras that wouldn't work, satellites which were supposed to spin into orbit but didn't, and delays which had threatened to cut back the 15 missions that had been planned for this year. Another big NASA project to put a permanent space station in orbit, a place astronauts could shuttle to and from. That plan had run into problems and had been pushed back, perhaps to the late 1990s. A planned unmanned mission to get a closer look at Halley's Comet was scrapped completely. Not enough money. There have been other criticisms. For instance, that the military was moving in on NASA, taking over more and more of the civilian space program, changing NASA's traditional role. Even at the top of the agency, there's been trouble. Administrator James Beggs, forced last month to take a leave of absence, indicted on a charge of defrauding the government when he was an executive at General Dynamics some years ago. NASA's current acting administrator, William Graham, brand new on the job in the midst of this crisis. But NASA has survived previous problems, from the earliest days of the unmanned rocket tests through the drastic fire 19 years ago yesterday aboard Apollo 1 on the launch pad at then Cape Kennedy, taking the lives of Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Robert Chaffee. So today there were promises to keep going. Test pilot Chuck Yeager.
When you have an accident like this, it doesn't mean the end of everything. I mean, you got to fall back and take a look at it. But the main thing is that you've got to analyze the data and find out what caused the accident, then take your corrective action.
At the Cape, Vice President Bush.
We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
Obviously, NASA will carry on. But tonight, many here are saying that each time the agency needs to ask for more money, people, or equipment, they may be harder to come by now. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
The nation's space program is, of course, tremendously expensive. It is supported by the taxpayers, and it exists only at the discretion of Congress. But NBC's John Dancy has found considerable support in Congress, even in these difficult times, for the continuation of the program, despite the enormity of today's tragedy.
Tom, Congress has shown tremendous support for the space program. It has a budget of about $7.5 billion, even at a time when other programs are being cut. But today, Congress was stunned.
We ought to take a deep breath and step back before we go ahead with any further manned flights.
And it's my opinion that we should lessen the emphasis on civilian involvement now because of the danger.
And NASA now has to find $1 billion plus, close to $2 billion now in its budget to replace this loss. And given the restrictions of Graham-Rudman, they are going to have some problems in realigning their schedule and their priorities.
Challenger was one of 4 U.S. space shuttles, a hugely expensive machine used for both civilian and military missions.
If there was a substantial delay in the shuttle program, it would have I think, a rather serious impact on our modernization of our satellite capabilities.
Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska heads the subcommittee that appropriates money to pay for military missions aboard the shuttle.
1/4 of the civilian space program, one of the 4 shuttles, blew up today. Is it going to be replaced?
Yes. We will find a way to replace that because I think it's essential, and we're sort of self-insurers in that regard. But it's my judgment that the American public will want that program to go ahead, and will want to really carry out the program, try to attain the goals that those people on board, the 7 crew members, have sacrificed their lives for now. I think that's going to become even more important to us now.
So, Tom, while there is a mood here to find out what happened and make sure that it doesn't happen again, I found absolutely nobody here who wanted to cut or cancel the space program. Tom?
But we're really dealing in a time of almost fiscal austerity in this country, and especially in the federal government. The Challenger today cost $1.2 billion to build. It probably will cost more than that to replace. Because the program will be offline, it means that we don't have any income coming into NASA as a result of the Space Shuttle program. Has anyone really figured out the economic consequences of what happened here today?
Well, the consequences are going to be very severe, Tom, because I don't think we're looking at a delay of a month or 2 months. We're looking at a long delay here until NASA figures out exactly what went wrong and fixes whatever it was that went wrong. But it is essential that the country continue with the space program, because remember, this is not only a civilian program, it is a military program as well. And a lot of the eggs in the military basket are riding on the Space Shuttle program. And of course, the military can use what are called expendable rockets, one-time use rockets, and get up many of its satellites that way. But they also depend on the Space Shuttle.
I'm not denying that, but what I am suggesting, or John Dancy, we call him Bud, his name is John Dancy. I'm not denying that, John, but what I am saying is that this just puts more pressure on the deficit, which is already considerable in terms of pressure.
There is no question that it does put considerable pressure on Congress, but there is also, I think, a sort of philosophical question here, an image question. Will the United States pull back at this point? I don't think they will. I think, as Ted Stevens said, they'll find the money and go ahead somehow.
All right, thanks. John Dancy at the Capitol tonight. Vice President Bush flew to Cape Canaveral early this afternoon, along with Senators Jake Garn, who flew on the shuttle mission last year, and John Glenn, who, of course, was one of the early astronauts. Vice President Bush and Senators Glenn and Garn now have just arrived back at Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington, D.C. tonight. They were there to represent the president as Vice President Bush met with members of the family.
We had a very moving meeting with the families, and I don't know that I've ever been more touched, because Mrs. Scobie, the wife of the commander of the flight, said she was speaking for all of the families, and the message that she wanted to tell the Vice President and Senator Glenn and I was that the space program should go ahead. They didn't want it slowed down or stopped, and they knew that their husbands and wives, families would want that too.
NASA is busy with an investigative team already analyzing what happened. They went through their plan with us before we left for how they're planning to investigate the whole thing. And they'll find out what went wrong before anybody else is launched.
John Glenn, who went to Cape Canaveral tonight with Vice President George Bush and Jake Garn. As you heard, they met with the families. The indication from the senators, of course, was that the families of those people who are the regular astronauts, the 6 members of the space crew, indicated to the Vice President that they wanted this program to go on. We have our correspondents assorted around the country right now. Steve Delaney is at Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center, and Dan Molina is at Houston, the Johnson Space Center. Robert Bazell tonight is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Bob, let's begin with you. What about the future of the space program? We have talked about that at great length all day long. As you heard John Dancy say, Congress seems determined to continue it. But do you think it will continue along the lines of putting all of its money on the shuttle program, or will they begin to diversify?
Well, Tom, I think one of the things to consider is that right now there is this national pride issue that John Dancy was talking about that we must go on. But I think that as the hard financial decisions are made, some other things might come into play. And I think one of those things is that even before this disaster, and that's the most important point, is that long before this disaster, there were questions about the shuttle program and how effective it was. And I don't think anybody was saying that we shouldn't have a manned space program and that we should abandon a manned space program. But the fact is that many of the things that the shuttle does can be done by unmanned spacecraft, and perhaps much cheaper and perhaps certainly with less threat to human life. So that those kind of considerations may well come into play when Congress begins to think about whether to appropriate that extra $2 billion to buy another shuttle orbiter.
And Dan Molina, what are they saying in Houston in terms of the future of the program? All of the money continue to go into the shuttle program, or is there any talk around the edges down there, at least, of diversification of some kind?
Tom, we're really not hearing anything about that here tonight. I must say, walking around here at the Johnson Space Center this evening, what I see is an amazing focus of energy. It seems like the people here at the Johnson Space Center now are attacking the biggest problem perhaps that they have ever tackled, and that's finding out what went wrong with this thing. I see this focus of professionalism, which we've come to identify with the space program, mobilizing itself this evening here. There's none of the political talk here. What there is this mobilization of effort to try and find out what in the world went wrong.
And Steve Delaney at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral tonight. What about the personal side? Down there you were mingling, as it were, as I guess a kind of novice yourself, watching the first shuttle launch that you have seen so far. The people who came to watch today, not only Krista McAuliffe's parents, but her husband and children, as well as members of her son's third-grade class were there. Are any of those people left around there, and what has been the personal reaction to what was witnessed there today?
Well, I think we have to go back to what the senators were saying when Senator Garn was saying when he came back. We have not had any contact with the members of the families, but I'd like to chip in a thought that because there was a teacher in space and because so many children around the country were watching this liftoff, it was almost their flight, their surrogate, their teacher, or somebody representing their interest was along. And it was a way to draw young people into the mystique of space, to kind of make the linkage between the John Glenn era and the idea of getting out and dealing with the idea that the future is really up there where those 7 people disappeared to tonight. That one of the things that will impel more movement toward finding out what went wrong and towards coping with the disaster that happened here today is to redeem the American promise, the promise of space for those kids, to indicate somehow to them that it shouldn't end this way, or it shouldn't be a setback, that there is something grand and something glorious to be attained out there, and that the space program, almost for that reason, will have to go on and will have to redeem itself and to kind of erase what happened here today.
Robert Bazell in Pasadena, I want to talk with you about some of the personal side as well. You knew Dick Scobie, who was the commander of this flight. In fact, you had a conversation with him at one point about the possibility that something could go terribly wrong as it did today, didn't you?
That's true, Tom. We've been talking about that a lot today on many of the NBC programs. Dick Scobie was a fighter pilot. He was a test pilot. He was decorated. He had received many medals for action in Southeast Asia. And we were driving back from the Cape one afternoon, and he told me that he thought that someday this would happen. He said, he put it very bluntly. He said, someday the shuttle's going to blow up. And I think his wife expressed what were his views, what he told me, this was several years ago. He said that he really wanted the shuttle program to go on, but he said that it was inevitable. It's a complex piece of machinery. It's got enough explosives in it to make it into a small bomb if something goes wrong, and that's exactly what happened today. So I don't think to the astronauts in the program, I don't even think to the engineers in the program that this is a terrible surprise that this happened sometime. I mean, nobody knows why it happened today. But I think that everybody thought that it was inevitable that eventually it would happen. Obviously, it's a terrible setback, and nobody ever wanted it to be. But as some of the people we've talked to over the course of today have pointed out, it's a machine, and no perfect machine has ever been built. And when this machine went wrong, it caused a terrible tragedy.
The fact is that it's sometimes hard to convey the commitment and the dedication of the astronauts to that program. They have given up their life in many instances to to NASA, and I don't mean that in the cruelest possible form, but that is, it's a very rigorous program in which they're engaged. They have to move to Texas in most cases. They spend long hours at what to the rest of us would be boring, even tedious tasks. They have to face disappointment. Some of these people who have been in the program for a long time have not yet been in space. They've had to wait for many months, even years to go up. Judy Resnick was one of the astronauts who died today in the explosion aboard the Shuttle Challenger. She was someone that I knew relatively well because we met when the first shuttle was scheduled to be launched, and she was assigned to NBC News as our expert commentator. And I used to talk to her about this at some length. Here was a classical pianist. She had a PhD in electrical engineering, and yet her life was absolutely given over to NASA and to the idea of being an astronaut. At the same time, she did have a pretty good sense of humor. We used to have a little friendly bet from time to time about whether NASA could keep its launch schedule. And when I lost one, for a six-pack, quite honestly, I sent it to her at some expense, wrapped in a dozen long-stem roses. And she immediately sent back the message that she loved the beer, but the roses she didn't need necessarily. So these are people who believe very strongly in the space program and want it to go on. In all the history of spaceflight, however, there never has been a disaster like the one that we witnessed today. 7 lives lost, 7 families in mourning tonight, along with the rest of the nation. And as NBC's Dennis Murphy reports now, the grief is shared by the entire NASA community.
Across the bay from the launch pad, Titusville, America's space town, was stunned and silent at the news.
Now, the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time.
Offices stopped.
We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion.
I just started crying and backed up and walked away because I knew it was really bad.
And all of us would stand up, you know, we just couldn't believe what was going on, you know, just in total shock.
It's really subdued. It's hit this area real hard. People take it real personal. This is the pride of Titusville.
Titusville and the shuttle program are inseparable. 3 of the 5 city councilmen work for NASA. The astronauts killed in 1967 are remembered in city street names. The Chamber of Commerce has an old Titan missile in the yard. The elementary school is called Apollo, and the high school is known as Astronaut. There are 14,000 people here who work in the space program, an army of specialists who put man in space. City Manager Hector Figueredo.
It's the same thing, the same feeling that we have here when President Kennedy was killed.
And the cloud just stayed over us like a fireball.
And Titusville has hosted tourists like Oliver and Joyce Boland from England.
Terribly sad, but it is and does have an objective, whereas blowing people up in Libya or Vienna Airport has no sense, no objective whatsoever. So I'm sure you'll go on with the space project, and I'm sure it's right you will do so.
With the families, the friends, the school children who watched this morning, Titusville mourns. Dennis Murphy, NBC News, at the Kennedy Space Center.
No doubt, all of America could have learned something from Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher who would have brought a lesson from space home to her classroom, indeed, to all of the nation's classrooms. Home for McAuliffe was Concord, New Hampshire. NBC's Fred Briggs traces her journey from Concord to Cape Canaveral.
Concord is a small town, capital of a small state, and while too large to be the sort of place where everybody knows everybody, they at least know of everybody. All felt they knew Krista McAuliffe. She was raised in the Boston suburb of Framingham and met her future husband, Stephen, in high school. They both attended a state college there. Then later they were married after she got her master's degree in education. They eventually moved to Concord. Krista McAuliffe was one of 11,000 who applied to be the first civilian in space. It was eventually narrowed down to 10 people who got to know each other very well. And when she was chosen...
When that shuttle goes, there might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me.
She went through the rigorous, compressed training given to non-professionals. Saw her first launch last year. Couldn't quite believe it.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And from time to time, there were always reporters asking if she had any fear about the mission.
It doesn't frighten me in the respect that they have a lot of backup systems. They don't fly the shuttle when they have something go wrong. And when it does go wrong, if something does go wrong, they do have the capacity to land it.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Her students were elated this morning, then the explosion, uncertainty, and silence. They were sent home from school, needed to be sent home.
I felt as if my whole body blew up inside when I saw that.
Later this week, NASA was setting up a special two-way hookup between the Challenger and the school so that Mrs. McAuliffe could teach one of her classes from space. She had rehearsed for that not long ago inside the shuttle.
Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe.
Late today in Concord, its people were in a kind of civic and very personal shock.
It's hurting all of us around Concord. We didn't know Krista personally, but we just felt like she was part of the family.
I feel so sorry for the family and for everybody in Concord.
A memorial service was held tonight at St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church. She was a member there and was remembered tonight.
She was a teacher. She was a teacher first and foremost, and she wanted to teach even from space. She will not be defeated. She will teach us, and she will teach us because of her ambition, because of her courage, because of her willingness to participate in our space program.
Perhaps, but here and in much of the nation, it is a hard lesson. Fred Briggs, NBC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
It has been one of those days that we would rather forget, but it's been one of those days that we'll always remember. It started, as all space launch days do, in such a festive fashion, filled with expectation and celebration. The shuttle, after all, is a kind of national symbol, and this time a pretty, perky schoolteacher was on board. Her parents, her husband, her children, her students, all looking on and cheering, awaiting another triumph of technology. And then the explosion. Something that we have all talked about but never quite believed would happen. It was a humbling, sobering experience, a common bond, a reminder of the supreme sacrifices that others make so that we may go on to new frontiers of the human experience. NBC News will continue its coverage of the tragedy of the Challenger beginning tomorrow morning with NBC News at sunrise, followed by the Today program. For now, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News. Good night from all of us.
Main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
This has been an NBC News. Tomorrow morning on Today, a complete report on the explosion without warning of the Space Shuttle Challenger. What does it mean for the future of the space program? Tomorrow morning on Today.
Clear.
So that people understand.
Accurate.
We'll be right on the money with it.
Fair.
I just wanted to call and check.
When you need news, you need NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Up next on News 4 New York, the crew of the Shuttle Challenger perishes in a massive explosion in space just a minute after liftoff. The students of schoolteacher Crystal McCullough watch in horror as her life ends in that explosion. We'll have a report for you from New Hampshire.
We'll have a live report from Cape Canaveral on tonight's investigation and the search for the shuttle debris. We'll have reaction from Americans whose lives have been touched by today's tragedy. And locally, the lawyer for Queensborough President Ronald Mcnair announces his client is stepping aside. That's up next.
In the competition to build your office information system, one player is strong in computers, but not in communications. Another is strong in communications, but not in computers. At 9X Business Information Systems, we're strong in both, and we'll tie everything together in one system that works as simply as this. 9X Business Information Systems.
They come from all over the world to run. 151 sleek new driving machines from 33 manufacturers. This is the toughest race in the country. The Sales Marathon in New York, New Jersey, and Southern Connecticut. Every car is a runner-up, but one. Right now, Cutlass Sierra from Oldsmobile is '1 in this tri-state New York Marathon. Drive the Cutlass Sierra. Get 7.9% financing on Cutlass now.
From your good old guy.
She's the divine Miss M with the sassiest mouth in show business, and Bette Midler uses it to sound off in this week's People. People celebrates people, like Miss Midler, shocked by her very happy marriage. Then a People special, Jessica Lange, Mia Farrow, Cher, and 20 other Oscar hopefuls, plus Liz and Stevie Wonder, England's new sensation Sade, Yoko Ono's lost daughter, and much more. Week after week, People celebrates people. This week, get it straight from the mouth of Bette Midler.
Music videos, Kids Under the Influence, tomorrow at 6 on News 4.
Good evening. The investigation into our nation's worst space disaster continues tonight.
Well, by now, you certainly know what happened. A catastrophic explosion destroyed the Space Shuttle Challenger a minute and 14 seconds after launch this morning, without a doubt killing the crew of 7, including schoolteacher Crystal McCullough. And it happened in full view of their families and friends and a nation watching on television. A horrific spectacle that's hammered us all day like a recurrent nightmare.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger lifted off normally at 11:38 this morning to the cheers of spectators. Among them, Crystal McCullough's husband and 2 small children, and her parents, watching as the spacecraft streaked upward through a dazzling blue sky. The launch was, in the arcane language of NASA, nominal, perfect.
3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
No indication that Crystal McCullough and the 6 other crew members now had less than a minute to live. They had boarded Challenger this morning in high spirits after 2 days of launch delays for various reasons. Crystal McCullough flashing a smile. 52 seconds into the flight, Challenger had reached an altitude of 9 miles. Its 2 solid-fuel booster rockets flanking the main fuel tank were under a minute from normal separation. Mission Control told the crew to go to full throttle on the 3 liquid-fueled engines. Shuttle Commander Michael Smith acknowledged, saying, "Roger, go at throttle up." His final words.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up.
It was over in an instant. The Challenger and its main fuel tank seemed to vaporize. The 2 solid-fuel boosters arced away to either side. Smoldering debris dropped away, tracing jagged white lines against the blue sky. What was left of Challenger would splash into the Atlantic for nearly an hour.
Based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
The explosion was clearly visible to the spectators at Cape Canaveral. Crystal McCullough's parents seemed to stare upward in disbelief as a voice over a loudspeaker confirmed the worst tragedy in the history of the U.S. space program.
Everybody, please get off the
We mourn their loss as a nation together. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy.
Speculation about the cause tonight centers around the shuttle's huge external fuel tank. It appeared to rupture. It is just speculation, though. And tonight there are reports that tiles from the Challenger are washing up on Florida beaches, and the people are collecting them as souvenirs.
The Canaveral calamity stunned official Washington, which funds NASA. Among those to speak, two who were there in space. Senator John Glenn, the original American space hero, and Jake Garn, the first senator to take a shuttle ride.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
The House of Representatives observed a moment of silent prayer and adjourned for 2 hours after the accident. The Senate was not in session, but had a special prayer meeting.
The shuttle crew members who died came from as far away as Hawaii and from as close as upstate New York. Connie Collins has more on them and Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space.
As is the tradition for shuttle astronauts, the seven gathered together this morning for their last breakfast on Earth before ascending into the heavens. Commander Dick Scobie, 46, Pilot Michael Smith, 40, Mission Specialist Judy Resnick, 36, Ronald Mcnair, 35, Allison Onizuka, 39, Payload Specialist, 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis. And then there was the first teacher in space, 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe, who beat out 11,000 other applicants who wanted to be the first to actually conduct a class from space. Her final selection from among 10 finalists who gathered at the White House was an emotional one.
I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me.
Today, the families of these 7 people, including the parents of Krista McAuliffe, watched in horror and total disbelief as the spacecraft with their children aboard exploded.
1 minute, 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet. Obviously a major malfunction.
Krista McAuliffe's 5-year-old daughter, Caroline, had not wanted her mother to go.
Because I don't want her to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
But this teacher had a dream.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Seeing the Earth, seeing the perspective of the Earth, and just being able to see the planet. I mean, you see it in pictures, but be able to see that in reality is going to be wonderful.
Nonetheless, saying goodbye to son Scott and little Caroline had not been easy.
Love you.
But Krista McAuliffe had to go, for she had wanted to see the world from another perspective.
See you later, alligator.
Connie Collins, News 4.
In honor of the 7 crew members who died today, President Reagan declared a national period of mourning through Monday, and flags at all public buildings will be flown at half-staff.
In Krista McAuliffe's hometown, pride turned to disbelief, shock, and then mourning. McAuliffe students watched as their teacher's dream ended in a nightmare. Carol Jenkins has more from Concord, New Hampshire.
Tonight, in memory of Krista McAuliffe, one of their own, the residents of Concord turned on their porch lights and promised to wrap her family in the warmth of the city's arms.
There's a lot of us that just don't really know how to deal with this, I think. It's pretty traumatic.
Everywhere, the young and the old carried their grief, the weight of this inexplicable horror.
It is perhaps here at Concord High School where the most intense reaction to this tragedy took place. These students were to be a part of history through their teacher, and this day started on a high note.
1,200 students of Concord High were gathered before monitors throughout the building. Laughter and party hats and noise obliterated for several moments what was really and tragically happening.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
We had, of course, all seen the explosion. We thought it was the separation of the rockets from the shuttle itself, and all went quiet.
Students were escorted back to their classrooms, offered counseling if they wished it or needed it, and then sent home to gather their emotions.
Well, I felt as if my whole body blew up inside when I saw that. And I can just never be as shocked as I am now. Made me feel empty and really upset.
But it was not only the young affected.
I went home immediately to help my little daughter through the pain that I knew she'd be feeling. She ended up helping me through my tears.
She was a great teacher. She was a great person. She could communicate. She had that smile. She always had a helping hand for anybody. She was extremely well-liked and accepted here at the school.
And so the town of Concord, New Hampshire, where Krista McAuliffe taught and lived and raised her own children, has only begun to mourn her loss. This is Carol Jenkins, News 4, Concord, New Hampshire.
We'll have more on the shuttle tragedy when we return.
Let's Chi-Chi's tonight. Come to the good times of Chi-Chi's. Incredible.
Come fill your senses with an incredible evening at Chi-Chi's. Good food, good fun, good people. All the flavors of Mexico you like best. It's a lot of living for very little.
At the incredible Chi-Chi's, America's Mexican restaurant.
Lawrence, next time go to Chi-Chi's.
Chi-Chi's.
At 110 miles per hour, engineers find the new Honda Accord LXI hatchback to be quiet and comfortable. At half that speed, you could find it to be twice as quiet and comfortable.
Your New York, New Jersey, Connecticut Tri-Honda dealers.
Do you know who I am? In the past few years, the Industrial Development Agency of the city that I work for has arranged low-interest loans to the tune of $600 million for companies big and small. We've helped over 400 firms stay here and grow here. If you make it in New York, you deserve a lot of credit, and IDA will help you get it.
A clogged fuel injector can make your car slow, sluggish, unresponsive. But only 2 tankfuls of advanced formula Mobile Super Unleaded can actually start to unclog fuel injectors. To give your car a new injection of power. Mobile Super Unleaded, high octane, with a plus.
Flemington Furs, bigger than ever January 1st sale now on. Up to 60% off our regular low prices. Flemington Furs, open Sunday and every day.
Tonight, NASA set up a special panel to look into what caused the shuttle to explode in midair at Cape Canaveral. Search for debris in the Atlantic Ocean has been called off for tonight, but will resume at first light tomorrow. News 4's Terry Answer is at the Cape right now with the latest for us. Terry?
Well, Chuck and Sue, right now everybody knows what happened here, but nobody knows why it happened. As you just mentioned, the air search has been called off for the night, but right now there are 7 military ships searching the Atlantic for any kind of debris. So far, only small pieces of wreckage have been found, and those pieces of debris are being taken to Patrick Air Force Base near here, where they will be quarantined from the public because officials say they are potentially radioactive, contaminated, and dangerous. The effort to pick up the pieces of this puzzle began only minutes after the explosion. All the data from the launch, the handwritten notes of NASA personnel at their consoles, were impounded and will be turned over to that special investigating panel. There are no answers here at Cape Canaveral tonight, only grief. And the tragedy is deepened by the death of an ordinary citizen, a 37-year-old school teacher from New Hampshire who carried with her the dreams of every American who has imagined soaring into space.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission.
As Krista McAuliffe's mother and father watched the dramatic launch here this morning, there was no sign of trouble. NASA officials say all readouts from the spacecraft were okay. And then suddenly, there was disaster. At first, the onlookers here at the Cape were confused. They didn't have any high-powered TV camera lenses. All they could see was a puff of smoke and the shuttle disappearing. Then, their worst fears became reality. Later this afternoon, Vice President George Bush came here to offer an official statement.
We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
Bush came here to meet with and console the family and friends of the shuttle crew. The students who came here from New Hampshire to watch the launch with school teacher Krista McAuliffe have gone home to New Hampshire. And now, tonight, we are still awaiting answers from NASA. Back to you.
Thank you, Terry. Sue?
In Spring Valley, New York today, the in-laws of shuttle engineer Gregory Jarvis, like many Americans, witnessed the tragedy on television. Therese and Jim Straub had joined their son-in-law and daughter in Florida last week to share in the excitement of the shuttle launch. But with the numerous postponements, they ran out of time and had to return home.
Shocked that it doesn't entirely register right away. You know, I was worried about it when he first talked about it.
No water. At 6 on News 4.
This is News 4 New York with Chuck Scarborough and Sue Simmons.
Good evening. Chuck is off tonight. As the nation mourns the loss of 7 astronauts, rescue crews comb the Florida coast for clues to what caused the world's worst space disaster.
NASA has picked up hundreds of pounds of wreckage, mostly small twisted pieces of metal, remnants of the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew to bits 72 seconds after liftoff yesterday. News 4's Terry Answer has the latest on the investigation and search from Cape Canaveral.
A Navy ship brought in one of the largest finds so far, an unidentified cylindrical object that reached the dock tonight. And there was a new mystery when a Coast Guard cutter spotted a cone-shaped object floating in the water and called for help. Is it the spacecraft's nose cone? Searchers can't say.
They're out there picking up whatever they find. They found this object and they want to get it and then bring it in and let NASA decide what it may or may not be.
No comment from NASA tonight on the new discoveries, nor will officials shed any new light on possible causes of the accident.
The harm in speculating is that when you start pointing fingers at a particular part of the orbiter or a particular manufacturer of something, then everybody is going to rush out and say, aha, you know, what did you do to cause this great tragedy?
Earlier today, more pieces of the puzzle washed up on Florida beaches. People have been warned not to touch anything, but NASA officials fear that some clues may be picked up by souvenir hunters.
We need every piece of that, because we don't know where the clue might be.
Some news photographers who came here to cover the story unintentionally are part of the investigation tonight. NASA has impounded pictures taken during the launch by cameras from 60 news organizations, including the New York Times. The photographers are protesting, but there's no word from NASA on when that film will be returned. Terry Answer, News 4 New York at Kennedy Space Center.
President Reagan phoned families of the victims today to offer his condolences, and he will head a special memorial service Friday in Houston.
And in Clear Lake City, Texas tonight, friends, neighbors, and NASA co-workers mourn the Challenger astronauts at a memorial mass. Clear Lake City, near Houston, is the home of the NASA Space Center. More than 1,000 mourners jammed St. Bernadette Catholic Church, and Father Thomas Butler urged them to share their grief, to have faith that the shuttle program would fly again. Earlier today at Mission Control, the man who directed Challenger's last climb spoke of the horrible chain of events, and he still seems shocked.
It's awful hard for these flights, and we train under every scenario that we could possibly imagine. There was nothing anybody could have done for this one. It just stopped.
Green insisted that everything seemed to be normal, that nothing was unusual up to the time of the explosion.
As the shock of yesterday's space shuttle disaster gave way to mourning today, the outpouring of sorrow transcended national boundaries and rivalries. At the National Museum of Air and Space, lawmakers unveiled a plaque in honor of the astronauts. Under a model of the space shuttle, they were eulogized as martyrs in the exploration of space. In New York, flags throughout the city were flown at half-staff, and down on Wall Street, trading on the New York Stock Exchange came to a halt for 1 minute this morning in memory of the 7 Americans killed on board the Challenger spacecraft. At newsstands throughout the world, the Cape Canaveral tragedy dominated the headlines, and America's sense of grief and loss was even shared on the streets of Moscow.
It's a very big loss for humanity, especially the women. In fact, one just wants to cry.
At the Vatican, Pope John Paul II prayed for the 7 astronauts and called them courageous pioneers for human progress.
And tonight, the small town of Concord, New Hampshire is thinking of the woman who represented all of them. Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher astronaut, is being remembered in a special way there with grief and loss. Carol Jenkins reports from New Hampshire.
How do you put this together to understand what happened?
Well, I really don't know.
For Heather King and the rest of Concord, New Hampshire, this day after was spent wrestling the conceivable answers to the ground. How indeed does the mind comprehend, let alone reconcile, what had happened? At St. John's Regional School, where Krista McAuliffe and her family had attended Christmas Mass, a special service for students. One not of formal dogma, but of stuffed animals and touching, as Father Dan Messer reassured the gathered children, God wants to hug us, to tell us it's okay.
I just cried all the time because I really, like I see her every Sunday. So.
Sister Ann Kelly felt the children were making a slow but steady progress toward understanding.
And to know that we can be a support for one another, that you just don't go off by yourself and cry and feel badly, that we all share in this.
Townspeople sent messages to one another, be brave, as headlines reinforced the bad news. Main Street, Concord, New Hampshire, flags reduced to a respectful stance.
How do you think this town is going to get over the shock?
Well, it's like everything else, I guess. We've all got to go along and live. You know, I mean, she will not be forgotten, I mean, because they're our people. I mean, they belong here and they're part of us.
There was silence at the McAuliffe home today, where Krista lived with her husband, Steve, Scott, who is 9, and Caroline, 6. Marley Wilson lives across the street. Today, she is a friend in mourning.
It's a shocking one. It's annihilation in an instant, and it's correspondingly difficult to accept.
Here at Concord High School, where Krista McAuliffe taught for 4 years, classes were suspended for the day, but the school administration sought to offer counseling help for any students who felt they might need it.
It's just very moving, and the whole town is just sort of very upset. Very upset.
But the people of Concord are not alone. They have come together to heal the hurt. Carol Jenkins, News 4, Concord.
The memorial service, the family of Ellison Onizuka. And the members in almost every incident, the immediate family of the 7 from Challenger. In the vernacular of the space program, it is known here simply as 51L. And on the memorial program today, that is exactly what it says. Memorial for the crew of 51L. A mission that was to have been launched in 1985 from what's known as the primary launch site, Cape Canaveral, of course, and carrying with it 7 astronauts, and yet another experiment, in this case a satellite, for deployment in space. Joining me here this morning, ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space so eloquently for us. Lynn, when we come here, we outsiders to the Space Center, we have a very strong sense of family. Are we accurate?
Oh, I think so, Peter. The people here take care of one another. They don't all consider themselves each other's best friends, but they understand that they are all in this business together, and they watch out for one another. They also are very protective of one another, and they are trying all the time to keep certain things perhaps from being in the press, from going out into the rest of the world. Not so much because these things are secret, but because they sometimes think the rest of the world simply doesn't understand. I think it is probably enormously gratifying to most of the people here in this space community that, in fact, the world does seem to have understood this tragedy. No one is treating it any other way but with complete sympathy and horror, and I think that is probably one of the only good things that may have come out of it. They understand the world is with them.
One of the flight controllers mentioned to me this morning what Steve McAuliffe Krista McAuliffe's husband really said in his letter, which he issued the other day, that they thank the nation for comforting them. This Johnson Space Center is replete with symbolism. And speaking of that, on this date, January the 31st in the year 1958, when the Johnson Space Center was very little, the United States launched its first satellite into orbit, Explorer 1. Those of you who have followed space throughout these years will recall it was the satellite that went out and discovered the radiation belts around the globe. And here at the Space Center there is, but we cannot see it this morning because many of the buildings that closed at the Visitor Center, an enormous mural which gives you some idea of what NASA's plans for the shuttle are. Those of you who visited here will know it. If you haven't, you should come, because it is a wonderful depiction of man in space some years from now as a result of the shuttle program. Senator Gary Hart from Colorado. It shows shuttles and men and women in their spacesuits floating and working on building a space city. A space station, of course, being one of the prime goals of the shuttle program. Lynn?
Peter, you were there. We're looking now at a picture of course, John Kennedy Jr., President Kennedy, very active in getting this whole space program started. Peter, you were talking about visitors before and saying people should come. You must remember, they have never stopped coming here. The Space Center is closed today, but there have been visitors here for the last few days, obviously just wanting to come here to look, to touch, to be part of the memorial somehow.
And Lynn, you were also saying earlier about how the program goes on here in some halting way. Senator Thurman?
Well, yes, the Space Center is not closed. There are people here with jobs. Despite this awful accident, and even though the primary responsibility now is to find out what happened, people here still have jobs, and until they find out when the suspension of the program will be lifted, many of them are trying to get on with their jobs, even though they have no idea if what they're training for, in fact, will ever take place again.
Well, you were mentioning John F. Kennedy Jr. It was President Kennedy himself who said back in May of 1961, now is the time to take longer strides. A message which has been very much repeated by President Reagan, and at least according to the ABC News poll, which we took earlier this week, by most of the people in the nation.
And certainly, Peter, the people here at the Space Center, the overwhelming sentiment among the astronauts and their families and the families of this crew have all said, let the program continue.
The 539th Air Force Band, the Air Force Band of the West from Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. Let's listen. Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where we preserve the artifacts of our exploration. From the Wright brothers aircraft to the Shuttle, which has in Washington this week been a particular shrine, if that's not too strong a word, where people have gone to share in the history of space, to remember, for example, another anniversary. It was 15 years ago today that Apollo 14 was launched from the Cape, where people this morning have also gathered, carrying astronauts Alan Shepard, Stu Rusa and Ed Mitchell. And while this is a day of human connection at the Cape and in the Atlantic waters off the Cape, the search for the evidence, the attempt to solve the mystery continues. Today, officials of NASA have been somewhat surprised at the large pieces they have been finding which survived Tuesday's fireball. Sonar had detected a very large metal object on the floor 140 feet down in the waters of the Atlantic as NASA and the Navy and the Air Force have had to expand their search area because of the winds and the Gulf Stream. No comment will be made today, of course, by NASA on anything concerning the search. The President and Mrs. Reagan have been here at the Johnson Space Center for about 40 minutes now. And they have been meeting with the families, and of course coming with the President this morning is our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson. Sam?
Peter, the President's mood is described by his press secretary as matter-of-fact and straightforward. 39 on the... Got here as $1 billion.
Family members who are greeting them now.
Dead off. We're here. That looking at the front of the audience. The President said to them, be very brief, be appropriate. Mrs. Reagan, of course, going to stand from own chief.
If you are on Medicare, you are urged to pay...
Bothers me is that
that is
extended family.
Your...
We'll hear first. Kansas.
Pay their respect.
In-law Sally Ride.
Dr. William R. Graham, Acting Administrator, National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
Mr. President, Mrs. Reagan, families of the Challenger crew, other members of the NASA family, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here today to honor 7 brave Americans, the crew of the spaceship Challenger. Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, Ron Mcnair, Al Onizuka, Greg Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe were explorers who blazed the trail for the rest of us. Their courage and dedication represents all that's best in each of us and in America. The Challenger crew took something of all of us aloft on Tuesday. Their dreams of discovery are our dreams. And the men and the women of that flight will always live in our thoughts and in our hearts. I pray that families and friends will remember our pride and our gratitude and find some refuge in its warmth. God bless them all.
The invocation by the Reverend Bernard Hawley, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Salina, Kansas. He is the father of an astronaut. His son, Steve, was mission specialist on the last shuttle flight. Steve is married to Sally Ride, the first American woman in space.
We are gathered here today as a family that shares a common dream, common goal, common commitment, and now a common tragic and devastating loss. And as families do, we have drawn together to remember with love and faith 7 who embodied in a very special way that dream we all possess. Dick, Mike, Judy, Al, Ron, Greg, Krista. Shall we pause for a moment of prayer and meditation? O thou, whom we call by various names, approach by several paths, and yet all acknowledge as the source of life. Thy greatness is seen in this vast and wondrous universe. We turn now to thee because we need the assurance of a love equally great and wondrous. To feel that underneath are the everlasting arms, and to know that the hand that holds us is the hand we trust. We come here grateful for the many ways we have known those whom today we mourn as husband, wife, father, mother, daughter, son, colleague, neighbor, and friend. Each brings his or her own memories of love and laughter, of strength and tenderness, of enthusiasm and joy, skill and courage. And we are grateful for the privilege of having known them, having our lives touched by their lives, being bound by ties of love and caring. And now we pray for those who most keenly feel this loss. May they as surely feel the love that surrounds them, the caring that reaches out to them. May we be bearers of thy spirit of love, so that together we may know not only grief, but also the grandeur and the grace of life. Amen.
The Reverend Bernard R. Hawley of Salina, Kansas, whose son and daughter-in-law are both astronauts. The lay reading will be by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bolton, a Marine astronaut who was aboard the last shuttle flight.
A reading for hope and strength from the 46th Psalms. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her right early. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still. Know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge.
The Navy hymn, Eternal Father, unofficial hymn of flyers everywhere.
We come together today to mourn the loss of 7 brave Americans, to share the grief that we all feel, and perhaps in that sharing to find the strength to bear our sorrow and the courage to look for the seeds of hope. Our nation's loss is first a profound personal loss to the family, and the friends, and the loved ones of our shuttle astronauts. To those they left behind, the mothers, the fathers, the husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, yes, and especially the children. All of America stands beside you in your time of sorrow. What we say today is only an inadequate expression of what we carry in our hearts. Words pale in the shadow of grief. They seem insufficient even to measure the brave sacrifice of those you loved and we so admired. Their truest testimony will not be in the words we speak, but in the way they led their lives and in the way they lost their lives, with dedication, honor, and an unquenchable desire to explore this mysterious and beautiful universe. The best we can do is remember our 7 astronauts, our Challenger 7. Remember them as they lived, bringing life and love and joy to those who knew them, and pride to a nation. They came from all parts of this great country, from South Carolina to Washington State, Ohio to Mohawk, New York, Hawaii to North Carolina, to Concord, New Hampshire. They were so different, yet in their mission, their quest, they held so much in common. We remember Dick Scobie, the commander who spoke the last words we heard from the Space Shuttle Challenger. He served as a fighter pilot in Vietnam, earning many medals for bravery. Later as a test pilot of advanced aircraft before joining the space program. Danger was a familiar companion to Commander Scobie. We remember Michael Smith, who earned enough medals as a combat pilot to cover his chest, including the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star, in gratitude from a nation he fought to keep free. We remember Judith Resnick, known as JR to her friends, always smiling, always eager to make a contribution, finding beauty in the music she played on her piano in her off hours. We remember Ellison Onizuka, who was a child running barefoot through the coffee fields and macadamia groves of Hawaii, dreamed of someday traveling to the moon. Being an Eagle Scout, he said, had helped him soar to the impressive achievements of his career. We remember Ronald Mcnair, who said that he learned perseverance in the cotton fields of South Carolina. His dream was to live aboard the space station, performing experiments and playing his saxophone in the weightlessness of space. Well, Ron, we will miss your saxophone, and we will build your space station. We remember Gregory Jarvis. On that ill-fated flight, he was carrying with him a flag of his university in Buffalo, New York. A small token, he said, to the people who unlocked his future. We remember Krista McAuliffe, who captured the imagination of the entire nation, inspiring us with her pluck, her restless spirit of discovery, a teacher not just to her students, but to an entire people, instilling us all with the excitement of this journey we ride into the future. We will always remember them, these skilled professionals, scientists and adventurers, these artists and teachers and family men and women, and we will cherish each of their stories. Stories of triumph and bravery, stories of true American heroes. On the day of the disaster, our nation held a vigil by our television sets. In one cruel moment, our exhilaration turned to horror. We waited and watched and tried to make sense of what we had seen. That night, I listened to a call-in program on the radio. People of every age spoke of their sadness and the pride they felt in our astronauts. Across America, we are reaching out, holding hands, and finding comfort in one another. The sacrifice of your loved ones has stirred the soul of our nation. And through the pain, our hearts have been opened to a profound truth. The future is not free. The story of all human progress is one of a struggle against all odds. We learned again that this America, which Abraham Lincoln called the last best hope of man on earth, was built on heroism and noble sacrifice. It was built by men and women like our 7-star Voyagers, who answered a call beyond duty, who gave more than was expected or required, and who gave it little thought of worldly reward. We think back to the pioneers of an earlier century, the sturdy souls who took their families and their belongings and set out into the frontier of the American West. Often they met with terrible hardship. Along the Oregon Trail, you can still see the grave markers of those who fell on the way. But grief only steeled them to the journey ahead. Today, the frontier is space and the boundaries of human knowledge. Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short. But we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain. Our nation is indeed fortunate that we can still draw on immense reservoirs of courage, character, and fortitude. That we're still blessed with heroes like those of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Dick Scobie knew that every launching of a space shuttle is a technological miracle. And he said, if something ever does go wrong, I hope that doesn't mean the end to the Space Shuttle program. Every family member I talked to asked specifically that we continue the program, that is what their departed loved one would want above all else. We will not disappoint them. Today we promise Dick Scobie and his crew that their dream lives on, that the future they worked so hard to build will become reality. The dedicated men and women of NASA have lost 7 members of their family. Still, they too must forge ahead with a space program that is effective, safe, and efficient, but bold and committed. Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes. Dick, Mike, Judy, Elle, Ron, Greg, and Krista. Your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you. For those who knew you well and loved you, the pain will be deep and enduring. A nation, too, will long feel the loss of her 7 sons and daughters, her 7 good friends. We can find consolation only in faith, for we know in our hearts that you who flew so high and so proud now make your home beyond the stars, safe in God's promise of eternal life. May God bless you all and give you comfort in this difficult time.
Reverend Bernard R. Hawley again.
Will you please rise and join in the singing of America the Beautiful?
And so those ceremonies conclude here, and the work goes on again at the Johnson Space Center, the nerve center of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Agency. Other ceremonies were being conducted as well today across the country, as I indicated earlier, on the campus of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Greensboro, North Carolina. It is the alma mater of Ronald Mcnair, one of 4 black astronauts in this program. He graduated magna cum laude from that school. It is also the alma mater of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Now we would like to show you some of the sights and sounds of those memorial services today at North Carolina AT&T.
Our only consolation is that God can put the pieces back together. Many of our bodies, our minds, our broken hearts are hurting deeply today, but God can put it back together again. When the young and the brave and the courageous and the talented are snatched without warning, we feel robbed. Our foundation is shaken. Ronald Mcnair dead at 36. Dr. King at 39. Dr. Ronald Mcnair took us to the mountaintop of scientific exploration that we might see beyond the mountaintop that Dr. King stood on as he saw new worlds. A&T, this is holy ground. Every teacher is challenged. There's some more Ronald Mcnairs out there. Every student is challenged. There's a potential Ron McNair. That's your roommate. We're not Cohen-Husk. We are people. We are pearls.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson, another graduate of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. It's the alma mater of Ronald Mcnair, one of the astronauts who perished Tuesday. Mr. Mcnair was a magna cum laude graduate of that school. He went on to earn a doctorate in physics from MIT. He's a native of South Carolina. In Concord, New Hampshire now, NBC News correspondent Fred Briggs, who has been there since Tuesday's accident happened. It was the hometown of Krista McAuliffe. It is the state capital of New Hampshire. Fred?
Tom, at this very moment, the students and teachers are having a memorial service of their own at the Concord High School auditorium. No outsiders have been invited. In fact, President Reagan expressed some interest in coming here earlier in the week, and very politely he was turned down. It was not rudeness, it was just a need for privacy. When the staff and the students were debating how to have the services yesterday, somebody suggested inviting a representative of NASA, and then one girl said, "I don't think I could cry with a representative of NASA here." There is a need to cry here today.
Ask me nowadays whether she attended services regularly.
We were killed in that aircraft crash. And now this. It's been a very bad time from the standpoint of national loss in the last 2.5 years.
This particular loss today, Sam, of course, is being shared throughout the country by television. And in a somewhat more private, but not really more private way, in South Carolina, in North Carolina rather, there is yet another memorial service. As we've seen already, there was a service in California which was really to share this service. But in North Carolina, an enormous crowd gathers to remember, in particular, Ronald Mcnair, for it was North Carolina A&T State University that he graduated before he got his doctorate at MIT, where there is a particular pride today.
Were the basis of his dream.
Reverend Jesse Jackson was among those there to remember.
What lessons do we learn from this trauma? Are there treasures in the tragedy? Is there any honey in the rock? The curious search for new frontiers together is a treasure in that tragedy. America at its best, two women, a Jew, a black, an Asian, white males, more specifically an A&T graduate. At our best as a nation, we grow together, we expand together, we explore together, we live together, we die together with a kind of rainbow in the sky, treasure in the tragedy. Progress always comes after sacrifice.
North Carolina, yet another memorial service in this particular instance for Ron Mcnair, who along with Dick Scobie and Smith, and to some extent Judy Resnick and Greg Jarvis, have all gone in the last week from what I said was relative anonymity to the state of heroes without taking any intermediate steps. The exception, of course, was Christa McAuliffe. It was the president who decided that for such symbolic reasons a teacher would go into space to represent us all. And therefore we visit again Concord, New Hampshire, where the friends and the family and the students of Christa McAuliffe have gathered again today. Jay Shadler is there for us.
Peter, it is cold and it is somber in Concord, New Hampshire today. This, of course, was to have been a day when Christa McAuliffe was to have given a space lesson to the students of her high school, Concord High School, as well as other schools across the country. But instead, her students have gathered inside the gymnasium for time to eulogize her. It's a very private memorial service. The press has been kept out. In fact, there are reports that both NASA and Reagan administration officials had requested to send emissaries to this service, and they were denied. This is something that the students wanted to do themselves. It's also a time inside for them to reflect on Christa McAuliffe, who was more than just a teacher for many of them. She was a close friend for them as well. 3 local clergymen will be making brief remarks, and President Reagan himself has sent a telegram that we understand will be read by the Student Council president here during the ceremony. Condolences, and we assume as well a reaffirmation of Christa McAuliffe's own phrase, reaching for the stars. It's something that you hear the students speak of much in the last 3 days and on the streets here as well, Peter.
Jay, thank you. I was thinking this morning about the Talk of the Town Cafe in Concord.
Absolutely.
Where they had gathered this morning to watch the television. And this was the day on which Christa McAuliffe was going to give her lesson from space. And there at the Talk of the Town Cafe in Concord, just a few folks have gathered, like they often do, to chat. And we know what they're chatting about today. Lynn?
Peter, you were talking before about the sympathy from the rest of the world. Last night I was speaking with Reverend Hawley, who delivered that very eloquent sermon this afternoon, and he said to me that the whole point of a service like this, the whole point of a funeral, of a memorial, is we have to give people permission to cry. And that is what is happening, of course, all over this country today, but specifically right here. This is a community that is used to dealing with death, the professional fighter pilots certainly, but used to dealing with it in a very private way. Today, in fact, they got their permission to cry, and I saw a lot of those people out there, astronauts, former astronauts. I don't think there was a dry eye there, nor was there here in this building. I'm over in the, what they call Building 9A. This is where a lot of the shuttle training goes on. I spoke to someone just before the ceremony. She said Judy Resnick had been in here just 2 weeks before her flight, final training, said goodbye to everyone with a big smile on her face before she left after some final workouts with the remote arm. So I think, as I say, that Reverend Hawley certainly accomplished what he set out to do, as did this entire service.
What is the mock-up you're standing in front of?
That's a mock-up of the shuttle, and that's a full-size one, payload bay open, And that is exactly where the astronauts do their training. There is obviously no one training today. Nobody was training here yesterday. Nobody was training here the day before. The question being asked around here, of course, is when will they start training again? I must say, Peter, that I think that the President's words about we will continue the program, we will build the space station must have been extremely heartening to everybody here, although I think everybody is also extremely realistic and understands that none of that is going to happen until, in fact, the cause of the explosion is found. Nothing can proceed until that happens.
Lynn, it may sound a bit callous, I hope not, but in talking to a couple of the flight controllers here today, they thought that in some respects this tragedy would give a boost to the space program.
Well, Peter, I think what's happened is most people are looking back to the Apollo fire, and after the Apollo fire, not only did airline safety improve because of what they discovered, but somehow there was a sense that safety aboard the NASA flights had also gotten safer somehow. I think there is that feeling here. It is very strong among the astronauts with whom I've spoken.